And we are live. Welcome to Crypto Law TV. I'm John Deaton, the founder and your host. And today, got a great show. I'm looking forward to speaking to a very special guest. Before that, let me just update you. Big week in crypto, very big week. We've had Coinbase cases being dismissed. We have the Uniswap case investigation being dismissed. We have the Robinhood investigation being dismissed. And I know a lot of the people out there are like, well, what about the first case, the case that started it all? What about US SEC versus Ripple? And listen, it's a little more complicated because there was a judgment of $125 million for those early XRP sales. So here's what I can tell you. I believe 100% chance that the SEC will withdraw the appeal, just as they withdrew the Coinbase. The question is, will Ripple pay the $125 million, or will there be some kind of negotiation where Ripple pays part of it, half of it, 3/4 of it? I'm not sure, but I can tell you certainly within the next several months, this case will be over and we'll get back to it. Now, my special guest is Professor Evans. So let me tell you a little bit about her. She just released an article today. We're going to talk about that. She has articles recently, Electing Crypto Series, Trump's First 100 Days, the High Roller Crypto Bet, FDIC at a Crossroads, Debanking Crypto, and the Fight for Reform. She is a professor at Penn State Dickinson Law, which means she's very smart, a leading expert in fintech education, policy, and legal advisory through Advantage Evans LLC. She serves on the board of the directors at the Digital Currency Group and is author of Digital Money Demystified: Go from Cash to Crypto Safely, Legally, and Confidently. Tonya is a contributor to Forbes and Fortune magazine and hosts the Confidently Crypto segment on Financially Speaking podcast for SiriusXM. Welcome, Professor Evans, please.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I appreciate you. I've been looking forward to this. Are we ready to have some fun?
We are ready to have some fun. Listen, there's something, obviously I looked into who you are and your background. And the one thing I know, a passion that we both absolutely have, is the concept of financial inclusion. And the fact that, I got into crypto. Listen, I'm from welfare and food stamps, a single mother living in Detroit. And I remember my mother, she had to go to those check cashing stores because keep the minimum balance in the bank. So they would hit her with those predatory fees. So her welfare check would go to the check cashing stores you see in the hood, everywhere in the inner city. They would charge you 15%, 20%. When I got to college, I sent her money, when I could. I go through Western Union. They take 15%, 12%, 10%. So when I found Bitcoin and crypto, that's immediately what I thought about, how you can get rid of the predatory banks and MoneyGrams and Western Unions and people who really need it. It could help the unbanked, the underbanked. So you tell me your own story, please. Tell the audience, why did someone such as yourself, who is an expert in financial education, get attracted to crypto?
I started back in 2017. I remember it was around the time, I know that you remember, like the whole conversation, blockchain, not Bitcoin. And a lot of my colleagues were writing not a lot, let me not overstate it. A few, probably I could count on one hand, were actually writing articles about the intersection between intellectual property. I'm an IP lawyer by training. So intellectual property and what I was learning at the time of this new decentralized method of, time stamping data and disaggregating it, distributed ledgers. And it was kind of like this whole new world of language and also opportunities. And at the time, I didn't know what to make of what I considered to be, and I had to go through all the myth busting on my own because, as a lawyer, we are trained to spot the issues and problem solve. And so we, by nature, find problems everywhere, right? And so I wasn't clear on quote unquote magic internet money at the time, but I was very intrigued about the technology. I felt like it was, I read this article about ways that decentralized methods of organizing and securing data might be really interesting in the copyright world. So, and this is the way I always encourage people. Don't worry necessarily about the number go up. That's something that I love and we can talk about, but there's so many other things that you can start to see intersecting in your existing area of expertise, right? So I feel like my rabbit hole experience was really at the intersection of intellectual property and blockchain. What and it was around Thanksgiving. I think I was at my mom's house. I went into my room and came out like 2 weeks later, probably in the same pajamas. I said, leave the food at the door because I'm busy. Because I was like in YouTube University, like most of us, particularly at that time, and listening to all the podcasts and everything I could wrap my brain around, because I just like all the synapses were firing about how incredible. You go back kind of from a first principles point of view, and the brilliant 9-page white paper. I think it has like 7 footnotes that changed the world,
Right.
and that wasn't just happening in my area, but it was also happening across sectors. But what I ultimately learned, and why I know that you can't separate a conversation of the underlying technology and the OG of Bitcoin in particular, particularly because it's so special. It's kind of like, I don't want to piss off anybody, but Bitcoin is Bitcoin, is what it is. I come also from the DeFi world, so I'm kind of a both and person, but it is what it is. And you have to put some respect on Bitcoin's name. If you don't have a fundamental appreciation for at least having an alternative method of peer-to-peer exchange of money. I'm a Gen Xer, so I remember very clearly conversations around Napster and Grokster and, the peer-to-peer exchange of media files. Although that makes my intellectual property brain hurt, story for another day. But using that to exchange value, now that's a game changer. So those were the things that compelled me, kind of final point to say, I don't know what this means for me and my portfolio at this moment, back in 2017, 2018. But as, the tenured professor at the time, I had this vested interest in the next wave of lawyers being conversant in this space. And so at the time, I was the associate dean of the law school up at Franklin Pierce Law up in New Hampshire. Oh. I met some of the most wonderful people who sewed into me early into my career, talking like Michael Casey when he came out, and Paul, and they came out with their book, Caitlin Long, Sandra Rowe, like a whole bunch of people who I remember going to the Satoshi Roundtable and kind of hanging out with folks like that, just really looking underneath the hood. And that spirit of enthusiasm brought me in as a lifelong learner to empower the next wave of lawyers to be ready to meet the moment of all these seismic changes. So that's kind of my rabbit hole story.
Well, what you just basically explained is that you are an OG in this.
Oh, do I count? Because I think of some OGs before 2017, but yeah.
No, listen, I wish I'd have found it. I found Bitcoin in the white paper. I read it in late 2016. And, went down the rabbit hole. And I know a lot of people, you mentioned Bitcoin, and we're going to talk about tribalism because I think that, tribalism was rampant, whether it's the Bitcoin maxis versus everybody else, or the ETH maxis or XRP, and Bitcoiners versus shitcoiners, all of that all got tabled because we all got a common enemy in the SEC, government overreach, Gary Gensler, regulation by enforcement. And for, I think, about 4 years, almost, certainly 3, I think tribalism was tabled a bit, because of this attack with the government putting its boot on the industry's neck. But since you do have a DeFi interest, you mentioned, put some respect on Bitcoin's name. A lot of people want to know, and I'll certainly disclose mine. Do you own certain cryptos? Because everybody likes to know. Someone like you, they're gonna, if I don't ask, they're gonna be like, John, you didn't ask her.
You pin her down.
Is right. What is she interested in? What projects or tokens does she own? If you don't mind sharing.
Sure. Well, I have modest amounts because don't come for me. If you come to my house, it's a bad day for you. I'll say that. Very bad day. If you're on the outside, it's okay. If you come in here, we don't have a conversation. But I love Bitcoin. I don't think that it certainly hold Bitcoin. I'm a fan of XRP. I wasn't, interestingly, let me tell you, when back in 2017, going into 2018, I didn't know anything about anything. We all are a work in progress, but I remember early on, um, the things that I held early, certainly Bitcoin, ETH, and XRP, and also Stellar. And
Okay.
then I had a come to Jesus talk around this coin called Mom Coin. It was during the ICO boom and bust. I lost a lot of ETH and evidently on my mom coin. I'm not a mom. What the hell was I buying that for? I don't know. Were those the early meme coins? I don't know. But I tend to keep it really, really tight.
Yeah.
I'm pretty conservative about my investments. And I have like an overall portfolio strategy. Crypto in general, Bitcoin in particular, will always be a part of that. And then things that I'm passionate about. I really love Filecoin because I love the project. You know, that idea of having a decentralized version of file storage
Yep.
and the foundation. You know, I really love that project. I'm the former chair of the Maker Ecosystem Growth Foundation.
Wow.
I was kind of like a 2.0 board member that oversaw that to full decentralization. So that was kind of my entry point. And so obviously I have love for MKR. I know that there's a lot that Rune and the community are now doing to move over to Sky and some interesting things. So for me, in addition to this is how my approach it. So those are basically tokens. I'm no tea, no shade, but I'm not really a meme coin person.
Yeah.
I want to make strategic plays that are
Yeah.
going to make sure that my assets are out in the world working harder than me. Because if I'm working harder than my assets, then I'm doing something terribly wrong. So
That's a great.
you know what I
That
mean?
is a great. I'm gonna have to steal that.
Okay, you got it. You got it.
With your permission, of course. I'll give you credit though. You can.
Thank
I'll make
you.
sure I give you credit, but I got to make sure my my coins are working harder than me.
Listen, and so this leads me to the next point. Not only will I have the assets that put me in play for this next iteration of the internet, which is the internet of value, Tapscott and all those kind of talk about that. But in addition to that, once you have those, how do you leverage them in the same way that I might leverage stocks and go into options trading and things like that? In what ways can I further unlock that value in a DeFi space and also support the next wave of innovation, right? So it's a both and. That's why I said earlier, kind of just like both and. Yes, I'm going to individually invest in my future and from an intergenerational point of view, but how are we sewing into the infrastructure as well? How are we doing kind of the axes and the eggs type of thing, right? I think that we lost a lot of that across the board in the prior administration. And, you know, I was a crypto for Harris person. That ethos and spirit certainly hasn't changed, but the former administration, and I know we're going to get into it, it just was so incredibly frustrating that for all of the partisanship that can be as a matter of philosophy for wherever you fall on the political spectrum, and it's like the collective you, not you, but some things just you know, you miss the moment of, in the interest of harming an industry, you harm all the people that it would have served. And I always
Absolutely.
see opportunity in it. I always saw if somebody never became an investor, because so much of my conversation, you know, I'm extolling the virtues of crypto ownership, but people don't see themselves as investors if they're living less than paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
But there are ways that you can really change your life in terms of being an innovator in the space. And that was so incredibly wrongheaded and painful to me over these last years. So that's why I feel like you have the coalition, despite differences, to say we have to, this is not sustainable and we need a different direction for leadership.
Yeah. Listen, it was unfortunate that crypto became partisan issue. I never would have expected that. Right.
Right.
I could understand, and I think in the Democratic Party, it's more of an age issue. And you know, my political opponent this last election cycle had a lot to do with it. Senator Elizabeth
Mhm.
Warren, you know, ran her reelection building an anti-crypto army, which I didn't think made a lot of sense. And I think, you know, objectively that, because she's such a leader in the party, that hurt, you know, the Democrats, and
Mhm.
it became a partisan issue. And I think hopefully now you're seeing articles where you're seeing leading Democrats are also coming out, whether it's Richie Torres and or others coming out and being pro the industry. My biggest fear, Professor, is that what attracted me to Bitcoin and crypto, you know, um, about helping unbanked individuals, that it's just going to be captured by traditional finance and the industries, you know what I mean? And it ends up being only in the hands of a few of the wealthy as well. And so my question to you is, how do we, and you're someone who's in the business of education, I think is the key. How do we prevent that from happening? How do we prevent, whether it's the billionaires owning Bitcoin and crypto versus people living paycheck to paycheck, lifting people out of poverty, eliminating friction and fees like we were talking about earlier? How do we do that? How do we make sure that doesn't happen?
I think we have to deal with the elephant in the room of trust. And so we always in our industry talk about trust, and some people describe it as the absence of trust, but you and I know it's not the absence of trust, but trust in the code and in the transparency and the accessibility of it. But we also have to know that there's a trust issue with the industry. It's the reason that I wrote Digital Money Demystified, literally like the top 10 myths I had to confront about scam, fraud, only for illicit activity. And now we have to add that additional layer, only for those who are wealthy. I think those who are, whether or not they're wealthy, more savvy and sophisticated, and also have less to lose, and then therefore have a larger risk profile. They're willing to take on more risk because the consequences of not getting right aren't the difference between you and your family eating or not, or getting your bus pass, or whatever you need, or getting to work. So the opportunity to have at least a sufficient amount of information so that adults can make good and better choices, whatever age or stage, that has to be a part of the conversation. Our industry poured a gazillion dollars into the political sphere, and the industry is now reaping the benefits of that in terms of a change of power. That's not the end game. That, to me, is the beginning. The responsibility now is, or the conversation, I hope, will change from, all right, we just want to know what the hell is going on so that we can build businesses and serve people. Great. All right. Case dismissed, case dismissed, case dismissed, case dismissed. We're working on it. Here's a task force. When we say come into the open door, you won't leave in handcuffs, right? Like, let's have a chance here. Let's get rid of the case by case enforcement and the arbitrary and capricious actions. Let's get some rulemaking authority. I teach administrative law in addition to crypto law and info privacy law and IP. So it's like a really interesting package to come together in this very unique way. All right. If we have those structures in place, what do we do with it? The onus is no longer fighting the common enemy, although you always got to keep an eye on the enemy. What are we going to do with it now? We asked folks to stand with us to make some changes. And now those changes have occurred. We also know that this does not happen in a vacuum. There are a lot of people hurting, uncertain. There's a lot going on. So while there's a lot of exuberance, like, thank God we can finally just do it, what the hell we wanted to, and make sure that the good faith actors rise and the assholes and the criminals and the crooks are out, right? So that we're not belaboring, the good faith actors and the Coinbases of the world while FTX is happening. How does that make any sense? So with that, we need the protection of the industry that allows good faith industry participants and also the people who would benefit from using stable coins and being exposed to that area. I really feel like that is going to be the moment that de-risks the area for people so that they can get in and become more acquainted. Maybe they come through stables, but then grow into other areas that take over the ownership that we would have for people who move into the space.
What do you think is the number one barrier before we reach those folks, whether they're coming through, using stable coins, if that's the door that they walk through? What do you think our number one barrier right now is?
I've been thinking a lot about that because as I even start to build out my own consultancy, it's like, where is the best use of my time, talent, and treasure to kind of bridge this divide? And you can't just roll up to any community and have a conversation, again, when there's no trust. You can't go into every community, and that's across socioeconomic levels, right? It's people trust who they know. And so, who are the people connected most closely to grassroots? Are there organizations? What are the institutions? In what way are we leveraging education? And what way are we leveraging folks like me who believe that so much of traditional education is dead as well? That nobody is willing to pay a gazillion dollars for and stay for 4 years or 6 years or 12 years. And then you wake up and you're a shell of your former self and the world has changed, right? The
Right.
world has changed more in the last 2 years than the last 10. And what does that speak going forward? So I'm really hopeful for public-private partnerships. I've started to have conversations, even though it's not the grassroots level, when you're starting to talk to leaders about how they're going to lead their workforce or what changes they're going to make internally. Are they going to have education around Bitcoin IRAs and exchange traded funds and all of the other things that is not cold storage, Bitcoin, ride or die, a diamond hands, right?
Right.
But it's a step in the right direction because from 2017, real talk, it's not much easier to deal with the UI UX experience than it was then. And we've got, but I don't blame that just on an industry that was unsure and therefore had to, cast their innovation and their luck elsewhere because they couldn't do it in the States with confidence. So that's what I say, much more than the bottom line of investment was a disaster. The opportunity to educate people when people were ripe for education back when everybody was home, right? And they're buying NFTs, et cetera, et cetera. We lost a golden opportunity. And then SBF happened,
Right.
some bank stuff, and we get to that. The implications of that really harmed us.
Well, one of the things, you've said it a couple of times now, which is the trust factor. And one of my other major concerns, as I'm excited just like everyone else about, the potential of the future. But I'm also concerned that we might not do the priorities that we should. For example, I worry on this crypto council that you see at the White House or all these other. Is there a voice for the retail investor? Is there a voice for the consumer? Because, a lot of people accuse me of not wanting regulation because I was fighting the SEC. It was the opposite. I wanted smart, tailored regulations because I know that was holding the industry back. But we have to have consumer protections in there, whether it's consumer accounts, a Coinbase or a Kraken. If there is a bankruptcy, like in the FTX situation, that consumer funds aren't, commingled with the business funds, and that if there's a bankruptcy, that customer funds don't become the property of the bankrupt entity, that we require 100% reserves in those situations, maybe, limits on the rehypothecation of Bitcoin and all of that. Do you see any talk about those things? And do you think that that's necessary to build that trust?
It's necessary, and I don't hear it. I don't hear it. I don't see it. I don't see a hashtag. I don't see a task force that is inviting diversity of thought, because our community is not a monolith. The people who are when you think of Bitcoins for the quote unquote rest of us, there's 99% of people in the world who would have access and power and control over their own destiny by having an asset with a hard cap that is only going to increase as institutions come in, buying things up, et cetera. We talk about Bitcoin reserves. There's only so much. 19 plus million is already done. So what are we going to do with the rest, right? there is no conversation to protect the consumer above and beyond any conversations we might have about bills moving through Congress. And we need to hear from Congress. There's only so much within the confines of agencies that can happen when you have oversight and you have the enabling legislation, the legislation that actually creates the framework for agencies that then go forth and execute the function that has been empowered to them. That power is delegated from Congress. So what we need to see is on a bipartisan basis, making sure that there's clarity, and making sure part of that is, let's not just be clear about how much can be built, but also creating the structures that don't inject the opaqueness of the current system into the new one that's supposed to be better, faster, cheaper, more transparent, more accessible, only
Right.
to replicate that under the guise of new technology. If that happens, we failed. And we have to continue to have these conversations, press legislators, press agencies who, the agency leads are going to act unless and until Congress says something different. So what's Congress going to do? We really have to push them to make sure that it's the both and approach of the reasonable rules of the road. I like very much how Hester Peirce approaches this topic. And then in addition to that, what are the inclusion around education for those who want to innovate, those who want to invest, how to use. I see so much of this going on in other countries. I'm like, why can't we do that here?
Right.
So is there a will and a commitment in the industry to do this? If so, I'm a fan of that. I'm going to keep doing it. I know that you are, but we need more of us having this conversation.
Well, listen, it's on us now because we've got the boot off the neck of the industry, and we see, which I guess we could talk about that now, which is the tribalism. One of the things you said is, hey, I don't want to piss anyone off, and it shocks me that people get so, I guess it's like a sports team, right? They get so attached to their token or their investment. I got XRP holders who love me and I love them back. And, but some of them be like, but I forgive John for owning Bitcoin, right? I love him and I'll buy him a drink for all his efforts and works, but I'll excuse him being a moron for buying a dinosaur technology like Bitcoin or whatever. And then of course I have friends who are Bitcoin maxis who forgive me, for being a shit coiner because I own XRP or another token. So, what's your overall view? Do you view the tribalism as a threat from within, as a serious threat from within, or is it healthy competition?
Oh boy. Well, if those tweets could talk, I've been called everything but a child of God, as my Nana would say. It's like, whatever, it's fine. My number still goes up, so go play with your mama, not me, as my friends would say. And honestly, I remember, back in 2017 when we had the N18, when we had the ICO boom and bust, and I just remember, like, maybe it was like Ruben, and I think what's the guy's name that wore the hat? He's a huge Bitcoiner, Jimmy Song. They were having all of these fights, and I think there was going to be a death match, or they were constantly arguing. But it felt fun. It felt fun that there was this huge, like, Bitcoiners were like, why the hell? This was not the intention. There's Bitcoin and everything else. And at that time, people would, and I'm sure a Maxi might still say that ETH is a shit coin, like literally the million other things but BTC. And I approach it from, there are so many wonderful options of ability to have a store of value, peer-to-peer exchange, in the same way that, I can tip with cash, or sometimes I need to send a Zelle. Sometimes I use Venmo, although I don't want to. Sometimes I guess Cash App. Sometimes I'm sending a wire. Sometimes it's the same day ACH. Sometimes I'm swiping a credit card. Sometimes it's a debit and I'm typing in a number. This is another means, not only, certainly of peer-to-peer exchange and point of sale, but also when I think of what the next step is for AI agents um, involved in e-commerce at that level where humans aren't doing the day-to-day things. They're just and I don't want to do that with my Bitcoin. There's some places where I have the privilege to say I'm far willing to spend anything else but Bitcoin. But I have a fundamental appreciation for the difference. And so that some part of that education needs to be there. And when we are so immersed and enmeshed, I think is the better word, in infighting, we're missing the mark of bringing people into the space, because outsiders outside of this bubble look at this and it's like, I don't want anything to do with that. Like, what the hell? Right? They have some idea of crypto Twitter. It sounds scary. It doesn't sound empowering. It doesn't look like them, and they're not going to be a part of it. And so, in what way can we be uh, uh, empowering with this technology in a way where we don't get lost in our own navel gazing? We're not doing our communities any service, and we're certainly not bringing on new people. We need them for liquidity, if nothing else. Like, let's create a more welcoming environment so that people who are not in this space on a day-to-day basis can actually participate.
Yeah, listen, my whole part of my whole crusade going fighting the SEC was all about just let's have a free markets and level playing field and let the technology that wins win. And
Mhm.
whether that's Bitcoin or a different token, the market will dictate one way or the other, as long as there's a level playing field, as long as there's not regulatory capture and all the things that have been going on. The reason why I brought tribalism as a threat and was that, for example, there's a lot of focus on the strategic Bitcoin reserve.
Mm.
And when you focus on that, then of course you're going to get Brad Garlinghouse from Ripple and XRP holders to say, well, wait a minute, why wouldn't you have a strategic crypto reserve?
Mm.
Then you get the Bitcoiners versus everybody else, and they're fighting. And I'm sitting there, hey, what about the stable coin bill? What about the market structure bill? What about making sure that we enact a law that outlaws any commingling of customer funds with
Mm.
the business's capital, protections in bankruptcy? How about reforming this accredited investor rule where it excludes everyone, right? My brother served 28 years in the Air Force, but he can't own private, equity
Right.
because he's not worth $1 million, net worth excluding his home, or doesn't make enough money. To me, that's oppressive. That's
Right.
not about uplifting people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I look at things like that where we could really accomplish something about inclusion and education and lifting people out of poverty, expanding the middle class.
Yeah. So
Uh,
thinking
but
about the thing that kind of comes to mind too is, and you and I have both been at conferences and spaces, and I just feel like the tribalism just really manifests as like this intense loyalty to a specific cryptocurrency or a specific blockchain philosophy that creates the divisiveness, that creates insular community. That division hampers our collective progress. If we can come together and really fight for reasonable changes, how do we talk about when we are doing cross-chain stuff and off-chain? Like, all of that requires that we talk about our respective communities and these insular communities. So if your ideas are all born in a vacuum and you don't have criticism and you don't have debate, you and I know what that's like. You go to law school and you have all of that. You can argue both sides of the issue and in the middle as well. You understand the person at the other side of the table and how we can both come away with the win, not a death match, unless you have to, and then you learn how to play.
if they're coming to where you're at, right?
Listen, don't even get me started. I can neither confirm nor deny this on this live cast, but we'll talk. But you just see so much value, so much value is lost when you cannot cross pollinate. And then, as you said, let the best emerge. Now, maybe we have to talk about the definition of best. What's the desired outcome? Because if we're not fighting for the same thing, then we can never come to that healthy debate that's going to make the industry better for the people it's supposed to serve.
All right. Listen, let's transition for a bit on. Let's talk about debanking because I know that that's something that you've written about, correct?
Absolutely.
I think.
And testified about a couple of years ago before House Finance. They changed the name in this administration, but the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Digital Assets. Absolutely. So I have quite a bit to say about that.
Yes, and you've written articles about it. I on Choke Point 2.0. I've actually launched as part of Crypto Law. A project is Shedding Light. We have another site dedicated just to the debanking issue. I believe you have your own personal experience. You want to share?
Absolutely. You know, I'm just an educator trying to move the needle, trying to go forward. Advantage Evans itself could not get a bank account. And for all, it's funny, for all of your assets, or they ask all of these questions. And I've been in this, I graduated from Howard Law School, editor-in-chief of the Law Journal, clerked in the Third Circuit, worked in big law. You check off all the things that one does.
Right.
Stayed in the same industry. I own property. Never been in any trouble. Right, adding more than I've taken, and yet to try to open a bank account so that I can educate people and accept Stripe payments for my from cash to crypto program. Sorry, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. Even trying to market my services at the time, it was interesting that on one hand, not being able to run Facebook ads, but then at the same time, the first Libra coin was out. It's like, you have a Libra coin. I literally went to your hearing, but I can't advertise my educational services to empower people to know whether or not at the time they should even deal with Libra coin. You know, it never came to fruition.
Right.
But yeah, I have my own personal experience. I know through my service for various boards, there are all sorts of companies that have been affiliated and have I didn't lose my banking privileges, but I was not able to get those in the early years, in those first years where it would have mattered. And it just frustrated me to no end. I've left financial advisors trying to have this conversation. And what I now know is the reason those financial service providers were not willing to have this conversation, or were giving me this narrative that I personally knew not to be accurate about the nature of cryptocurrency, and also knowing that the favored currency for illicit activity is the almighty dollar, and I don't see anybody throwing those out.
No.
So you know what I mean? So that was my frustration, to say, for the reasons you said at the top. If, as I was focusing on Black and brown communities and poor and middle class communities who can start to not just see themselves as consumer, or caught in a consumer class, but can also have an asset that treated for capital gains purposes, and start to have that conversation around financial inclusion and empowerment, and how important digital assets and ownership of them will be in this next economy. I can't have any of those conversations if I can't accept, that's hurting my business and my ability to put myself in. So it wasn't me like outside from a patriarchal perspective, but like literally this is happening to me. And if this happens to someone like me with all of the educational and some financial privilege, what's going to happen to everybody else? So that kind of led me to say, because I'm a pretty private, I'm not secret, but I'm pretty private and a little professor in my little professor life. I was like, I have to take a more active and public role, because this has to be better. I have to leave it better than I found it. So that, I started down that road to talk about the very thing that I'm so happy to hear that you have this separate thing. I want to hear more about that, because it's important to get, I love the whistleblowers. I love everything that's happening. So talk.
Absolutely. And we know that there's now hearings that are
Yeah.
taking place on Choke Point 2.0. How do you perceive the impact of regulatory measures being discussed, and where this issue is headed on the legal and regulatory side? Where do you see the future going?
So right now, I think we are in kind of the stop the bleeding, and also the strong signal that with the seat change, not only are any kind of case by case enforcements that have either been settled or dismissed, kind of that's like the first wave, stop the bleeding. What I see coming now is, okay, again, I said it earlier, unless and until Congress acts, this is what we have. So We need more communication between certainly the industry, but also organizations that have a vested interest in consumer protection. So that language is also included in any subsequent legislation that comes to redefine and reprioritize some things in for the agency side. Oversight is critically important. So, and subpoena power is everything to uncover and get to the bottom of issues. And so I see that happening. And I do think that people are going to have to be patient. The the slow pace of government is literally a feature. It's literally a feature. But that doesn't mean that we have to stop everything today. And righting this ship, I think, was an important step because we're not even 100 days in. And we've seen a lot of action and activity, which tells people, okay, we're moving in the right direction. And now let's get serious about actually listening to needs in addition to industry and what it means to build here in the United States to really live up to the promises that were made by pro crypto candidates. And now, where do we go with that? With much power, much responsibility. Um, so now, does the rhetoric and the policy conversations and the fly-ins and the meetings, all of that has to really start, particularly if we're going to get bipartisan support, that the consumer protection has to go hand in hand. It doesn't have to be patriarchal. It should not be, but it's necessary. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of people in the name of crypto doing some really shitty things. And that is going to translate into a continued erosion of trust in a time where we don't have a lot of time to figure this out.
Let me ask you, you mentioned bipartisanship, and I remind people of this every time I can, because we just got through, the election season. A year from now, Professor, it will be full swing midterms.
It will.
Right? And the reality is, and I point this out, this last election cycle, it was advantage Republicans in the Senate. There were many more Democrats up. This time around in the midterms for 2026, there are 20 Republican seats up for grabs and 13 Democrats. And so the Democrats have an advantage on the math, and we're only talking about 3 seats.
Right.
And then you get to the House, it's only 5.
Right.
It's the narrowest majority since 1931.
Wow.
And so it is very conceivable, historically speaking, that the incumbent party in the presidency will lose one of either the House or the Senate.
Absolutely.
And if the Senate flips, Elizabeth Warren is the chairwoman of the Senate Banking Committee, and she's not a fan of crypto. And so my question is, do you believe that, because I think you mentioned earlier on crypto for Harris, do you see the Democrat Party becoming more amenable to this technology and acknowledging that maybe, the anti-crypto army and all of that was not the right path?
This last election made the case. It is a losing ticket to be against the crypto industry. Be against fraud, be for consumer protection, but that is a separate conversation from the technology that is so empowering. It has been confounding to me why this is not a slam dunk for Dems. I'm confounded. I suspect that it has more to do with wrangling around banks and perhaps the perceived threats of this technology and the destabilization of the dollar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I get all that. But I think that this was far more than that concern. And that's the reason I was, screaming and yelling to anyone who would listen. I actually felt like we were getting, when I think about Vice President Harris's run, 107 days, and I can only imagine what that must be like in prioritizing. But even some of the conversations around someone who comes from California and may have been involved in tech, et cetera, that there were more conversations to be had. But I think the number one issue for those who want to be reelected is coming out against crypto is not it. That's not it. Also, when you have these very important stable stablecoin bills, two, if I'm not mistaken, in the House, one in the Senate. We have the Genius Act in the Senate. Maxine Waters, which probably should shock people, but I remember, and I wrote about this for Forbes last year during the election, where she was on the Native Land Pod and I just was listening because I think it was at the DNC convention. And then she happened to mention that we really need to reprioritize and kind of look at artificial intelligence and crypto. And I damn near fell out of my chair. I was like, yay, yay.
Yeah.
I can finally write about a pivot, maybe, possibly, purportedly, supposedly. And I remember being on that like one call, and I love Richie Torres, and there were a bunch of other people. There's a name that's escaping me right now that is a strong proponent. But anyway, say it again. Oh, yes, yes, thank you. Yep. That there are some really key voices that I think can move the needle, and I also think with the rough outcome for so many Dems have now had to reprioritize and focus on what matters. Focus on what matters about protection, but also innovation can be really, really important. And so I will continue to have those conversations. I do think that this is possible. I am encouraged by stablecoin legislation, although the article that I wrote for Forbes kind of compared and contrast the Genius bill with Waters' bill. And I think at the time I hadn't taken a close look at French Hill's bill, which seemed to align more closely with the Genius bill with some additional things. So anyway, I think that there's enough conversation and clarity. And I'm also hopeful at the state level here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We had a bipartisan bill that made it out of the House and is being considered. The change is afoot. Oftentimes we see things percolate at the state level that then pushes the federal level, but also we don't have that kind of time. We don't have another 2 years to figure this out. We have to prioritize these types of bills and also just be more vocal about things beyond investment that matter. People have always been looking for use cases. I've been saying the use cases are here. I don't think we're doing a good job of telling the story. So let's tell that story. Let's use those same resources and the collective conversation to go out to our respective communities and make the case. So I feel like seeing that in 2025 will advance some of the legislation that, or hopefully push to make sure that happens as well.
Yeah, and I hope now that maybe we've gotten past this meme coin phase and we can truly enter the utility phase, right? Yes. The utility phase of crypto and getting that message out. Listen, where can people find you on social media? And then I want you to plug that book. I love that title, Demystifying.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to send you one. I should have before. So there's a lot going on here, but I'll make sure you get. A copy. So I'm trying to just focus on one place, not the many places. I'm kind of a multi-hyphenate, John. But I'm trying to like focus in the second act of my life. So everyone can go to proftonyaevans.com. Unfortunately, I'm pretty searchable. But proftonyaevans.com, you can have access to my free trend report. I try to make it weekly, but I got a lot going on. And also something that I recently launched, John, is I call it Electing Crypto Tracker. I'm writing a book now. I'd like to put it out this fall, but I actually think I want to cull more data around the impact of the last election cycle, perhaps on the upcoming cycle. It's called Electing Crypto. So I have a Substack devoted to that and all of my updates. So that's electingcrypto.substack.com. So between those two places, listen, if you're a legislator, if you're a regulator, if you're in the C-suite, if you are trying to reskill or upskill to be literally the smartest person in the room, to at least ask the right questions. Even if you don't know the answer, you have to know how to ask the right questions, because then that will allow folks to bring in the resources and the people that they need to make the best decisions internally and outside. So I'd love to be a part of that in this continued conversation, sir. I want you to do me do me a solid and come on my pod on Sirius XM as well.
I will. Listen, thank you so much. I hope that our legislature people are paying attention. I hope to see you testifying before Congress, because we need voices like yours out there, making sure that the focus on what this technology can do. If we just become traditional, and you said it best, if it's just TradFi 2.0, if that's all crypto is, then I've lost interest and I want to move on with my life. And I just hope that doesn't happen with people like you out there pounding the sand. It won't happen. So thank you so much, Professor. I look forward to coming on your podcast and seeing you in person someday soon.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
All right. That's it for next time. Everybody have a great day.